They called it just a tariff. But to over 160,000 women, it was a war without bullets. On the 1st of August 2025, without warning, the United States imposed a 50% tariff on Burkina Faso's most precious export, shea butter. No negotiation, no explanation, just a signature in Washington and silence across West Africa. It was more than trade policy. It was a line drawn in dust, daring a landlocked nation to kneel. But in Ouagadougou, one man refused. President Ibrahim Traoré stood before a wounded nation and called the decision what it truly was: economic warfare. He did not beg. He did not bend. Instead, he pivoted, and with him, an entire continent turned to listen. Can a single nation, dismissed, landlocked, underestimated, redraw the global map of trade? Stay with us. What you are about to witness is not just a reaction. It is a revolution. Subscribe and walk with us, because this story belongs to Africa, and its turning point begins now. It did not begin with tanks. It did not begin with fire. It began with paper. On the morning of August the 1st, 2025, a quiet stroke of a pen in Washington set in motion one of the most consequential economic shocks in West African history. A newly issued decree from the Office of the United States Trade Representative imposed an immediate 50% tariff on all imports of shea butter originating from Burkina Faso. No consultation, no prior notice, no accompanying press release. Just a line item buried in a schedule of revisions filed, signed, sealed. And yet its tremor was anything but small. For Burkina Faso, shea butter was never just a commodity. It was women's gold, extracted, pressed, and sold by more than 160,000 women across the Sahel. From the cracked red earth of Kaya to the humid markets of Bobo Dioulasso, generations had built livelihoods around its trade. Shea was soil and sweat, culture and currency, the touch of heritage in every glob of balm-lining boutique shelves from Paris to Portland. For 2 decades, it moved quietly through global supply chains, uncelebrated yet essential. Then, in a single decision made oceans away, it was rendered unviable. No official explanation was given. Only whispers: national security, economic realignment, shifting supply chains. But for those closest to the source, the message was clear. This was no accident. This was no routine revision. It was a pressure tactic, one that treated a people's livelihood as expendable. In Ouagadougou, the silence was deafening. At the Ministry of Trade, phones rang unanswered. Procurement officers vanished from offices. Contracts with American buyers were suspended overnight. In dusty warehouses, cooperatives sealed their gates. Trucks laden with barrels of unrefined shea butter sat under the punishing Sahel sun. And women, thousands of them, looked to their hands and asked the same question: is this the end? Among them was Amanatara, a mother of 5 from the village of Bulsa. That morning, she sat cross-legged in the soil, churning paste from the nuts she had collected before dawn. Her fingers, cracked and powdered with ash, moved with a rhythm inherited from her mother. But her eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. There were no buyers, no trucks, no noise, only dust, heat, and a growing dread. This, they feared, was how collapse begins, not with fire but with emptiness. In the capital, the pressure mounted. Export coordinators from Bobo Dioulasso called American distributors in New York and Missouri, only to be met with silence. Drivers paid by the kilometer had nowhere to go, sleeping in their cabs for days. In villages, women began pawning jewelry for rice. Local broadcasters looped the same question: had the West just abandoned Burkina Faso? But in that vacuum, a voice rose. President Ibrahim Traoré, the young soldier-turned-statesman, did not wait for a formal inquiry. In a national address, he declared, "They tax our labor, our heritage, and the very hands that feed our women. This is not regulation. This is a weapon." The line traveled like wildfire, from cafes to border posts, from ministers to market vendors. The phrase was repeated in every dialect. For many, it was the first time they heard their struggle named with such clarity. Traoré had not just acknowledged the blow, he had framed it for what it was, an act of economic aggression. But more importantly, he did something few expected. He did not beg. He did not plead. He did not request reversal. Instead, he summoned his cabinet and began to pivot. In crisis, he found clarity. As barrels of unsold butter began to stack like tombstones of a crumbling economy, Traoré saw not only danger, but opportunity. He posed a question that few dared speak aloud. What if dependency was the true threat? What if this tariff, cruel as it was, could force us to become sovereign? And so, the first move of resistance was not retaliation, but reimagination. In a land too long shaped by external dictates, one man stood and redrew the frame. The West called it a tariff. He called it a turning point. What came next would not only test the resilience of Burkina Faso, it would challenge the foundations of global trade. At first, it looked like defeat. Empty warehouses, silent phones, idle drivers parked beneath a sun that offered no mercy. Cooperatives shuttered their doors, and women gathered under baobab trees not to sing or work, but to wait. Not even the rebels of the Sahel had forced such stillness. This time, it was not bullets that shook the country. It was an absence, the vanishing of trade, of income, of certainty. But silence, too, can become a drumbeat. By the 2nd of August, the mood had shifted. In Ouagadougou, President Ibrahim Traoré convened an emergency assembly, not in secret, but under the full weight of the Sahel sun with cameras rolling. He did not call it a crisis meeting. He called it a mobilization. Present were agricultural unions, cooperative leaders, civil society delegates, and trade ministers. The air inside the compound was thick, with heat, yes, but also with urgency. Then Traoré spoke. They will not break us by starving our people. The line hit harder than any statistic. It was more than defiance. It was a vow. And like wildfire across dry grass, the words spread. By midday, they were painted on walls in Bobo Dioulasso, printed in flyers in Kaya, whispered in courtyards, chanted at border posts. Women who had wept in silence the day before now stood taller. Lorry drivers returned to the cooperatives, even without cargo, to stand in solidarity. Radios played the quote on repeat. Children recited it like a prayer. This was not merely a political moment. It was a civic uprising, a reclamation of dignity, not through arms, but through posture. The Western decree had intended silence. What it triggered was an anthem. But Traoré's defiance was not just for domestic ears. In Nairobi, headlines read, "Burkina refuses to bow." In Mumbai and Dubai, television pundits debated whether Washington had overplayed its hand. In Dhaka, trade economists called it the start of a parallel supply revolution. In London, the SHA Futures Index, a niche commodity measure, surged by 11% as traders scrambled to hedge against supply disruptions. In Illinois and Georgia, cosmetic labs panicked. Shea butter wasn't just a nice-to-have. It was core. Its creamy consistency and high fatty acid profile were nearly impossible to replicate. Formulas began to fail. Substitutes felt synthetic. Consumer reviews tanked. In Denver, one beauty brand confessed, "Our creams no longer absorb the same." In Chicago, shop owner Clarissa Woodson stared at empty shelves and said quietly, 3 months now. No shea again. The tremor had crossed oceans. But the decisive blow did not come from Washington. It came from Beijing. On the 4th of August, just 3 days after the tariff, China's Ministry of Commerce announced official import licenses for 128 Burkina shea cooperatives. No tariffs. No quotas, no loans, just trade, 5-year guaranteed access, priority refining rights, technology transfer clauses, direct rail linkage to Ghana's Gulf port. It was not aid. It was alignment. In the presidential palace, Traoré stood before a map of West Africa. He traced old export routes westward to ports controlled by foreign shipping giants. Then his finger moved east along new roads towards partnership. "This is no longer theory," he told his ministers. "This is our new axis." At that moment, Burkina Faso stopped reacting. It started redesigning. The news broke like rain after drought. In the hills of Kenedougou, women danced outside cooperatives. One named Io adjusted her headscarf and said, "It means we work tomorrow, and next week, and maybe next year." Factories began to stir, not in Paris or Texas, but in Kenedougou and Banfara. Processing would now happen on Burkina soil. Contracts included mandatory royalties for women's cooperatives. Mandarin classes opened in rural trade schools. Logistics routes were reprioritized. Roads, once pocked with neglect, were paved overnight. This was not survival. This was architecture. Meanwhile, in Washington, silence deepened. The move had been calculated, a demonstration of leverage. But the counterpunch had landed where it hurt, in supply chains, in headlines, in perception. A landlocked nation had refused to fold. Worse still, it had found alternatives. What was intended to isolate had become a catalyst. And so the question now moved beyond Burkina Faso. If butter could shake the balance, what might Africa do next? The numbers told one story. The people told another. Within 10 days of the tariff, shea butter exports from Burkina Faso dropped by 32%. But beneath that cold statistic, something warmer, fiercer had begun to take root. In warehouses that once echoed with silence, the machines began to hum again. Not with the old rhythm of extraction for export, but with a new cadence of ownership. This was not recovery. This was a reclamation. The China deal, unprecedented in its clarity, carried conditions that changed everything. Processing facilities were to be built on Burkina soil. Technology transfers were embedded in the contract. Royalties were guaranteed to every certified cooperative. And, most revolutionary of all, no offshore arbitration. Disputes would be settled in local courts under Burkina law. Traoré was explicit. "We will not outsource our justice." In Banfara, women once barefoot under the Sahel sun now logged shipping manifest and managed cold storage schedules. Some were learning Mandarin. Others attended workshops on digital invoicing. This wasn't just trade. It was a transition from laborers to shareholders. In Kaya, cooperative leader Salamata Konate stood before her members and said, "We are not here to survive. We are here to decide." The women erupted in applause, but her words would ripple far beyond that meeting. Within weeks, they were repeated on state radio, printed on flyers, and inscribed on murals. For the first time in memory, mothers budgeting for school fees could trust the calendar. Payments, once delayed for months, now arrived within 72 hours. Cold storage hubs in Kenedougou extended product life from 5 days to 3 weeks. Transport corridors, once riddled with potholes, were now under active repair. Everything moved, not by miracle, but by will, and with movement came momentum. At the Ministry of Education, a curriculum revision was approved. New modules on indigenous trade history were introduced. One assignment asked students, "What does sovereignty smell like?" A 12-year-old girl wrote, "It smells like the butter my grandmother makes." But not all consequences were structural. Some were spiritual. Across the nation, musicians released anthems declaring, "Shea is ours." Poets drew parallels between cracked shells and colonial scars. Artists painted murals of women lifting barrels of butter toward a rising sun captioned, "From soil to sovereignty." A trade product had become a flag, a forgotten export, a source of identity. Yet transformation invites attention, and not all of it is welcome. On the 14th of August, government sources reported an incident along Route N10. A convoy transporting Trade Minister Hadari Diallo was ambushed en route to inspect new processing facilities. Though Diallo survived unscathed, the attack raised alarms. 2 days later, rumors spread of an Ibrahim Traore assassination attempt, unconfirmed but widely whispered across Ouagadougou. The presidency released a short statement denying any such threat, but the public mood was already shifting. People gathered not in panic but in vigilance. Young men organized neighborhood watches. Women stood guard outside cooperative buildings at night. The message was unspoken but clear. We've come too far to fall now. These tensions underscored a new reality. The pivot had not only disrupted global trade, it had unsettled domestic power structures. Interests long comfortable in silence were now exposed, and those who had fed off confusion, bureaucrats, smugglers, middlemen, found themselves cast out by a more disciplined, transparent state. In regional diplomacy, Burkina Faso's posture also changed. Where past governments had approached international partners with pleading hands, this administration came to the table with terms. At an AU conference in Addis Ababa, a West African envoy whispered to a journalist, "We used to ask. Now we negotiate." The shift in tone was unmistakable. Burkina Faso was no longer waiting for opportunity. It was writing it, not in slogans, but in contracts, schedules, and delivery receipts. Still, the road ahead was fragile. For all its newfound pride, the nation had become a case study, one that others watched closely, and some wished to sabotage. Yet within the borders, the people held their ground. Women returned to cooperatives not in fear, but with fire. Drivers resumed routes with certainty. Markets, once bracing for hunger, now moved with modest confidence. In every village, town, and corridor of power, a quiet truth began to settle. This was not merely survival. This was sovereignty, structured. The shock was global. But the responses revealed something deeper, a world order quietly shifting. In Washington, the mood was first dismissive, then disoriented. What had been conceived as a minor pressure tactic, a tariff targeting a small, landlocked nation, had spiraled into a public relations nightmare. Supply chains faltered. Small businesses complained. Cosmetic brands received a torrent of customer backlash. "This isn't real shea," read angry reviews. "Bring back Burkina's butter." Behind closed doors, U.S. trade officials scrambled for narrative control. They framed the move as a matter of national interest and supply realignment, but internally, doubts festered. Analysts briefed Capitol Hill aides that the policy had not only failed but backfired, accelerating China's economic foothold in a sensitive region. For Beijing, the opportunity was seized without hesitation. Just 3 days after the decree, China formalized a sweeping trade pact with Burkina Faso. No debt, no delay, just delivery. Within weeks, ground was broken on new processing facilities in Shenzhen, Tianjin, and Nanjing. But this was more than butter. This was strategy. In anchoring trade relations with Ouagadougou, Beijing strengthened a broader Belt and Road corridor stretching from the Sahel to the Gulf of Guinea. In Paris, the silence was telling. France, long the dominant post-colonial power in the region, found itself abruptly sidelined. No French companies were involved in the New Deal. No French officials were consulted. In the corridors of the Quai d'Orsay, diplomats whispered that Burkina Faso was slipping out of orbit. In Brussels, EU trade representatives debated whether to offer a counterdeal, but hesitated, fearing accusations of neo-colonial overreach. Meanwhile, Moscow watched with approval. On state television, Russian analysts praised Traoré's stance as a blow to Western dominance. Commentators framed Burkina Faso's pivot as part of a multipolar resistance, alongside moves by BRICS nations and Latin American assertiveness. Across Africa, the ripple was most profound. In Accra, Ghana's Ministry of Agriculture launched an emergency working group on cocoa verticalization. In Dakar, Senegalese officials revived dormant discussions on cashew processing. In Addis Ababa, AU diplomats pored over the Burkina-China agreement, searching for a replicable model. Across the continent, the tone had shifted from doubt to determination. One Kenyan commentator put it bluntly, "This is not just a shea deal, it's a blueprint." Still, the West remained skeptical and nervous. Think tanks in London and Washington speculated whether the rapid shift signaled an Ibrahim Traoré coup in regional trade alignment, not won by force but by architecture. If other nations followed, the long-standing dominance of Western buyers over African raw commodities could begin to fracture. That possibility, a continent trading on its own terms, was more unsettling to some than any military coup. Because in that future, Africa would not be waiting at anyone's door. It would be opening its own. The pivot was made. The contracts signed. The warehouses reopened. But the question lingered, what comes next? For Burkina Faso, the path ahead is both promising and perilous. On one hand, the new trade corridors and processing facilities represent an historic opportunity, a chance to break the cycle of dependency, to transform raw exports into refined industries, to keep wealth rooted in the soil where it is grown. On the other hand, the risks are undeniable. Reliance on a single partner, however generous the terms, carries dangers of its own. Today it is Beijing. Tomorrow, who will it be? President Ibrahim Traore has been clear. Vigilance must guide every step. Each contract must include technology transfer, royalties for cooperatives, and dispute resolution under Burkina Faso law. Sovereignty, he insists, is not a gift. It is structure. The policies he champions are not speeches, but schedules. Deadlines for infrastructure, timelines for processing hubs, audits to ensure revenues flow where they belong. Yet sovereignty is not built by governments alone. It is sustained by people. The women of Kaya, who once cracked nuts in silence, now learn to read invoices and manage exports. The drivers of Banfara, once idle for weeks, now map new routes toward the Gulf of Guinea. Students in Ouagadougou learn that trade is not charity but dignity. These shifts, cultural as much as economic, suggest a deeper transformation from survival to authorship. Still, challenges loom. Will other African nations dare to replicate this model, or will they retreat under pressure from traditional powers? Will the promise of value-added trade extend to cocoa in Ghana, cotton in Mali, coffee in Ethiopia, cashew in Senegal? Or will old patterns reassert themselves, dressed in new uniforms? History casts a long shadow. Thomas Sankara once declared that Africa must consume what it produces and produce what it consumes. For decades, that vision was dismissed as idealism. Today, in the voice of Traoré, it returns not as dream, but as design. The opportunity exists to reshape the continent's place in the global order. But opportunity is not destiny. It requires courage and discipline. For Burkina Faso, the crossroads is clear. One road leads back to dependency, raw exports, delayed payments, foreign arbitration. The other points forward, processing at home, contracts that respect dignity, a nation no longer asking but deciding. Which path will Africa take? The world is watching. But more importantly, Africa itself is listening. Because if butter can bend empires, what might cocoa, coffee, and gold achieve when claimed not as gifts to the world, but as instruments of sovereignty? What began as a line of ink in Washington ended as a line of defiance in Ouagadougou. A tariff designed to suffocate became the spark that reawakened a nation. Shea butter, once dismissed as a minor commodity, was transformed into a banner of sovereignty. Proof that even a landlocked country, underestimated and pressured, could stand tall and reshape its fate. But this was never only about shea. It was about the dignity of labor, the pride of women's hands, and the conviction that sovereignty is not granted from abroad. It is structured at home. The lesson of August 2025 will echo far beyond Burkina Faso. It asks the continent, will Africa continue to export raw wealth at the price of silence, or will it rise to claim its place as author of its own destiny? The risks are real. Critics whisper of over-reliance on Beijing. Rumors of an Ibrahim Traore assassination attempt remind us that transformation always provokes resistance. Old powers will not stand idle as their grip weakens. Yet the promise is greater still, a continent that negotiates with authority, not dependency. A generation that measures progress not by aid received, but by contracts signed on its own terms. In Accra, in Dakar, in Addis Ababa, the question grows louder. If Burkina Faso can, what stops the rest? Already commentators speak of an Ibrahim Traore coup in the architecture of trade, not with guns, but with agreements, not with soldiers, but with farmers, cooperatives, and workers demanding value. If butter can bend markets, what might cocoa, cashew, coffee, and gold achieve? The world has seen Africa as supplier, never as strategist. But in the wake of sanctions turned to opportunity, a new vision emerges. It is fragile, yes. It is contested, yes. And yet it is real. When women in Koudougou process shea in their own facilities, when drivers in Banfara chart new corridors eastward, when children in Ouagadougou are taught that trade is sovereignty, not charity, then the continent takes a step closer to Sankara's unfinished dream. So the choice is before us. One path leads back to dependency, the other forward to freedom. And every voice, every action, every contract matters. Do not let this story end here. Share it, comment, and declare it. Write Africa Rise, Africa Can. For every keystroke is proof that the whispers of dignity have become a chorus. Because in the end, this was never only about butter. It was about sovereignty. And in the soil of Africa, sovereignty has begun to bloom.